Hi, my name is Sarah Pearman, and I'm going to tell you today about research that we conducted on improving the consent flow for a health insurance chatbot. So I'll give you a brief overview of this project. A major health insurance company that we'll call HealthCo in this presentation is building a chatbot for customers to ask questions about their coverage. It uses Google Cloud APIs for storage and natural language processing. So because of HIPAA, sending any of the health data from the chatbot to Google Cloud requires special consent. So let me give you an example of when someone might use this, and this is similar to the one that we used to give to participants in study tasks. So let's imagine that our user named Danny hurts her ankle while hiking, and a week later, maybe it still hurts. She decides she might need an x-ray, but she's worried about how much it might cost. So she goes to the HealthCo website, and when she's there, she sees a chatbot icon in the corner, and she figures she can ask the bot so that she can avoid searching all over the website for her question. The chatbot then presents her with a HIPAA authorization document, and she'll have to read and agree to that before she can ask her question. So at a glance, this might look simple. Users just have to look at a document, then indicate that they agree to it, but informed consent is complex. Reading these documents is hard and time-consuming. Users are told by organizations like the FTC that they need to make these choices about health data carefully, but it's not clear how they should go about doing that. We know that regularly reading documents like this could add up to hundreds of hours per year for the average person. And the consent flow also interrupts the primary task. In this healthcare context, the primary task may be especially urgent, so that interruption is really inconvenient. And this creates pressure that makes informed consent really difficult to obtain, for example, if someone is in pain and really needs this healthcare. And it's also not as simple as just making it shorter. Data is mixed on whether various types of simplified and shortened privacy policies actually help people to understand what they're agreeing to. And due to legal requirements, there's always a limit to how user-friendly the text can be in length or in style. So we conducted a study with 2 phases in order to improve the consent flow for this particular health insurance tool. We first conducted a remote user study that also included interview portions, and then we conducted a crowdsource survey. So I'll first tell you about our remote user study. In this study, our questions were about first the usability barriers that users might encounter while trying to use this tool. We also wanted to know whether people understood that they were authorizing the release of data to a third party, in this case, Google Cloud. And we wanted to know whether they understood that their data was no longer protected by HIPAA when it was in the possession of Google Cloud. And we also wanted to know how people felt about the consent flow, both about the user experience and about what they were consenting to or what they thought they were consenting to. So in our user study sessions, we had users do a set of tasks and also answer some interview questions. They were given a scenario like the ankle injury example I gave to you a moment ago, and they were asked to show us what they would do if they wanted to ask the chatbot a question. And they did this by interacting with a clickable Adobe XD prototype. And we also asked follow-up questions about their usability impressions, as well as their understandings of and their feelings about what they agreed to. And we did 3 rounds of these sessions and iterated on the prototype each time based on what we observed. And we had 6 participants per round, all recruited from the Pittsburgh area on Craigslist, and we conducted purposive sampling for diversity and demographics and technical expertise. So let me walk you through quickly what the different versions of this prototype look like and how they changed in between rounds. So in each case, users start on the insurance homepage. They can open up the chatbot from the bottom right corner, and they would see a message like this: "Hi, I'm Sam the chatbot," and then they'd have to click "Let's chat" in order to proceed. In the first version of the prototype that we got from HealthCo, there were 2 ways to proceed here. You could click View Resources to see a sort of human readable summary, or you could go straight to the required part, which was the actual digital HIPAA authorization legal document that you had to view in order to proceed. If you click that, you would then see that legal document open in a separate tab as a PDF. You'd have to look at that and then return to the tab you were in before and click I agree. And then you'd be able to use the chatbot. So as you can imagine, one of the first things we noticed in round 1 was that opening the PDF in a separate tab was really confusing for people. So before round 2, we moved this flow into a simpler modal window, and we set it up so there was only one path through so that users didn't have to make a choice between viewing the human readable summary and viewing the required document. We also made some improvements to the readability of the document. We simplified some language and added some section titles. And we worked with the lawyers at HealthCo as well as the technical team to ensure that the HIPAA authorization covered elements of the model privacy notice from the US Department of Health and Human Services, and also accurately reflected how the chatbot actually worked. So in the second version of the prototype that we tested, it started off the same way. Users had to click Let's Chat in the bottom right corner. The human readable summary would first open in this modal window. People would have to scroll down and click Continue. And then they would see the actual required digital HIPAA authorization legal document, would have to scroll through that and click I agree, and then they would be able to use the chatbot. So there were a few things that we changed between rounds 2 and 3 based on how the user sessions went in round 2. So we added powered by Google Cloud in the initial window. You'll see what that looks like in just a second. We removed that additional step of showing the human readable summary. We had thought maybe that would help people with understanding, but it really just annoyed them. They didn't understand why they had to look at 2 different documents. And so we just incorporated the parts that seemed to be helpful from that summary directly into the HIPAA authorization legal document. And we also added some summary sentences at the top of that document that focused on the 2 points about Google Cloud and the data not being subject to HIPAA that were most essential and most commonly missed or misunderstood. So let me show you the third prototype. As you can see, we added that powered by Google Cloud language to this initial window. And then after clicking Let's Chat, you would just see this legal document with the improvements that we had made to it. And in particular, at the top here, you can see these summary sentences that say, before your first chat with Sam the chatbot, we need your authorization to share data with Google Cloud. This lets the chatbot provide personalized answers to your questions. Data stored by Google Cloud is not subject to HIPAA. Users would then have to scroll through that document, click I agree, and then they could use the chatbot. So as we proceeded through these rounds of interviews, we were doing some qualitative coding involving A, empirical observations of user interactions at each step of the task, and B, thematic analysis of more abstract understandings and attitudes. And after conducting all of these rounds, we also did some further thematic analysis to dig deeper into some of the themes we saw there. So many of the usability and user interface findings are unsurprising. Like we said before, in round 1, opening the PDF in a separate tab was really confusing for some people. In round 2, simplifying the flow and putting everything in that modal window helped, but people didn't like having to view 2 documents and they didn't understand why that was happening. And in round 3, the usability was really pretty decent and people generally did not have trouble getting through the steps. However, our thematic analysis suggested that even when the usability was better, the understanding was not necessarily better. Unsurprisingly, most people don't read those documents unless they're specifically prompted to do so as part of a study. The people who did read some of the content said, you know, it's just standard, it's just boilerplate. They said they're just trying to protect themselves from being sued, but they didn't really know what the company thought it might be sued for. And we also noticed that the word HIPAA alone sometimes gave people a false sense of security. What was especially concerning there was that many people, based on seeing that word HIPAA, ended up believing the opposite of what was true, thinking that the document was there to inform them that data could not be shared with third parties. So we then conducted a crowdsource survey to look further into these ideas and get some quantitative data about what was going on. So we surveyed over 1,000 people. We crowdsourced this on Prolific. The participants were all adults in the United States, and it was just the United States because the HIPAA aspect might not make sense to participants from other countries. Our sample skewed young and educated, but had a range of ages, good gender diversity, and most people were not experts in tech, healthcare, or law, although a few were. And so in the survey, users were first given a similar scenario as the one we described to you earlier with the ankle injury. They were asked to try to use the chatbot based on that scenario, and they saw 1 of 4 prototypes. And I'll tell you more about why there were 4 in the survey in just a moment. We then asked them some follow-up usability and understanding questions and some questions about their attitudes towards the chatbot. And then we had them go back and review the text carefully. And then we repeated some of those understanding and attitude questions. And we did that so that we could better understand whether any issues with knowledge about what was happening were related to people just not reading, or whether even if they did read, they still couldn't understand what the document was trying to tell them. So I'll give you some more information about the prototypes. Like I said, we tested 4 prototypes in the survey. So the first three were those three prototypes from the interviews. And then the fourth was a variation on that third prototype. So the fourth was intended to test some of those suspicions we had that the word HIPAA itself was giving people a false sense of security. So the fourth prototype was essentially the third prototype, but with the word HIPAA removed from it. So instead of digital HIPAA authorization, data sharing authorization. Instead of not subject to HIPAA, not subject to federal healthcare privacy laws. So here what we were doing in this survey is trying to test whether our qualitative intuitions about these prototypes were quantitatively supported. We wanted to see especially whether our final prototypes performed better on usability and willingness to use metrics. We also wanted to know whether those prototypes helped participants understand that Google Cloud would receive data. And we also wanted to know whether that removal of the word HIPAA from the fourth prototype would help people understand that data sent to Google Cloud was actually not covered under HIPAA. So we asked some background questions about how much people read these documents. We asked both how much people read of the document provided to them during the consent process, as well as a question about what they usually did in real life when they saw documents like this. In both cases, the most commonly selected answer was they skimmed those documents. And then people selected less frequently answers on either side, saying they really didn't read much of it at all or read all of it or most of it. And the distribution in this graph was very similar for the reading question about the specific document in this task, as well as for what they did in real life. We also asked some background questions to understand what people knew about HIPAA. When we asked, so overall, most people vastly overestimated the power of HIPAA to prevent disclosure. When we asked, what is HIPAA? The correct answer would be that it's a law that regulates how healthcare data can be shared. Only 22% of people got that correct answer, and 68% chose the more extreme answer, saying that HIPAA prevents anyone or any company from sharing healthcare information, which is not true. We also asked if HIPAA defines a piece of information as protected health information, what does that mean? Only a quarter of people selected the correct nuanced answer that it means a healthcare provider or other covered entity can only share with another person or organization with permission. 62% of people chose the more extreme answer that HIPAA means that no person or company can share protected health information without the patient's permission. And that's incorrect because HIPAA doesn't apply to all people or all companies, just certain healthcare related entities. So now I'll talk to you about some of the questions we asked people in the survey about the usability of the chatbot and people's willingness to use it. We asked people a Likert question about whether they found it easy to access the chatbot. Most people agreed that they did find it easy to access. The people who saw prototype 3 were significantly more likely to agree than the ones who saw prototype 1, and otherwise the differences between prototype versions were not significant. We also asked people about their willingness to use the chatbot by asking, based on the information you saw, would you use this chatbot? And we asked this once just after the initial task, and then again after people had reviewed the text. So I'll show you the differences between those answers here. In part 1, before carefully reviewing the legal documents, most participants said, yes, I would use this chatbot. That's the part on the left here. And then after that text review step, that number decreased significantly. People were less willing to use the chatbot. And the differences between prototype versions were not significant here. We also asked people questions about their privacy attitudes. One of those was a Likert question in which participants agreed or disagreed to the statement, I am confident that the privacy of my data will be protected if I use the chatbot. Before reviewing the text, as seen on the left here, overall participants were slightly more likely to disagree with that statement. But after reviewing the text, the number that disagreed was significantly higher, regardless of which prototype condition they were in. So overall, reviewing the text made people less confident in the privacy protections of the chatbot. We also asked some knowledge questions about those main points that I mentioned earlier, wanting to know if participants understood that Google Cloud would get data and that that data wasn't subject to HIPAA when Google Cloud had it. And so in both cases with those questions, we'll see that the number of people who understood that increased significantly after that text review step. So I'll walk you through those findings here. Before reviewing the text on the left side here, we see that less than half of participants understood that Google Cloud would get data. On the right side, we see that after reviewing the text, the vast majority of participants, about 80%, understood this correctly. So what we're likely seeing here is that initially participants were just not reading, not noticing this detail. And after reviewing the text, assuming that after reviewing the text, this means they've read at least some of the document, they could understand this. And there were not statistically significant differences between prototype conditions on this question. So we also asked, is data from the chatbot always subject to HIPAA? Like we said, the correct answer to this is no, because it's not subject to HIPAA when Google Cloud has it. So we'll see here that regardless of prototype condition, in the 4 bars on the left, only a minority of participants understood correctly and gave the correct answer to this question before the text review step. The results for prototypes 2 and 4 were a little better than for 1, but still at most a quarter of people understood this correctly before reviewing the text for any condition. And then on the right here, we'll see that especially for prototypes 2 and 3 and 4, the understanding of this detail was pretty good, with most people understanding after they had reviewed the text carefully. Prototype 1 also saw improvements, but not as many. It was still less than half of people who understood this correctly after reviewing the text for prototype 1. So here I'll summarize the results that we just talked about. The usability metrics were actually good overall, especially for the 3rd prototype. However, the understanding questions showed that the understanding was generally poor before text review, and then much better after text review. So before the text review, most people didn't understand that the data was not subject to HIPAA, and more than half answered incorrectly about whether Google Cloud would receive data. After text review, for the question about data being subject to HIPAA, the majority who saw any of our redesigned prototypes, 2 or 3 or 4, answered correctly. And then for the first prototype, after text review, people did improve their understanding, but the gains were more marginal. There were still a lot of people who didn't have the right answer. And for the question about Google Cloud receiving data, 77% answered correctly after text review, and there was no difference that was statistically meaningful between the prototype conditions on that question. It didn't matter which version of the prototype they saw. And after text review overall, people were more concerned about privacy and less willing to use the chatbot. I'm also going to just briefly talk about some qualitative analysis that we did on free response questions from the survey. So we asked follow-ups to lots of the multiple choice questions that I've talked about here, and I'm just going to highlight some primary results from that. So qualitative data here indicates a lot of confusion about the role of HIPAA. Before reviewing the text again, some participants were confident about the privacy of their chatbot data because they assumed it was protected by HIPAA. And so that creates this tension as we're trying to design the ideal consent flow between helping people understand the additional risk that does exist from allowing this data to be disclosed and causing them to overestimate that risk. So after reviewing the text, when asked what it meant for data to not be subject to HIPAA, at least a third of participants essentially concluded that Google Cloud could do anything it wanted with the data, which is not really an accurate or helpful way of understanding what risks their data might be subject to in this case, because there are still actually some protections. So the final takeaways here. Simplifying the flow and the wording of documents like this can definitely help to improve the user experience and to improve the comprehension of main points when people read the content. However, most people still won't read it. People also don't understand what it means for data to be subject or not subject to HIPAA. And so it's essential that people designing products like this and consent flows like this do not use HIPAA as a shorthand to help people understand the terms they're agreeing to, because it's really not a meaningful cue for people. Some people also do not seem to distinguish Google Cloud from other Google services in terms of data practices. And so further research should really look at how companies using cloud providers can communicate what that means and what can and cannot happen to data that is stored with or processed by those third-party providers. So I just want to thank my co-authors, Ellie Young and Lori Craner, for all of their help on this project. If you have any questions, I will be happy to answer them here at PEPR. or feel free to email me anytime at spierman@cmu.edu. Thank you for listening.